Subscribe to Tops Educators and don't forget to on bell icon.
So today we are going to talk about French Revolution. In order to do that, we have to learn about French society. In 1774, Louis XVI of Bourbon family of kings ascended the throne of France. He was just 20 years old and married to the Austrian princess Marie Antoinette. Upon his ascension, the new king found an empty treasury. Long years of war had drained the financial resources of France. Added to this was a cost of maintaining an extravagant court. Under Louis XVI, France helped the 13 American colonies to gain their independence from their common enemy, Britain. The war added more than a billion livres to a debt that had already risen more than 2 billion livres. Lenders who gave the state credit now began to charge 10% interest on loans. So the French government was obliged to spend an increased percentage of its budget on interest payments alone. To meet its regular expenses, such as the cost of maintaining an army, the court, running the government offices and universities, the state was forced to increase taxes. Yet even these measures would not have sufficed. French society in the 18th century was divided into three estates: first, second, and third. And only members of the third estate paid taxes. Peasants made up about 90% of the population. However, only a small number of them owned the land that they cultivated. About 60% of the land was owned by the nobles, the church, and the other rich members of the third estate. The clergy and the nobility enjoyed certain privileges by birth. The most important of these was exemption from paying taxes to the state. The nobles further enjoyed feudal privileges. These included feudal dues, which they extracted from the peasants. The peasants were obliged to render services to the nobility and the landowners. Surprisingly, the church too extracted its share from the taxes called tithes, or 1/10 of the income from the peasants. And finally, all members of the third estate had to pay taxes to the state. These included a direct tax called taille and a number of indirect taxes which were levied on articles of everyday consumption like salt and tobacco. The burden of financing activities of the state through taxes were borne by third estate alone. The population of France rose from about 23 million in 1750, that is early 18th century, to 28 million in 1789. This led to a rapid increase in the demand of food grains. Production of grains could not keep pace with the demand. So the price of bread, which was the staple diet of majority, rose rapidly. Most workers were employed as laborers in workshops whose owners had fixed their wages. But wages did not keep pace with the rise in prices. So the gap between the poor and the rich widened. Things became worse whenever drought or hail reduced the harvest. This led to a subsistence crisis, or the crisis of survival, something that occurred frequently in France during the old regime, that is the regime during the time of Louis XVI and before. The 18th century witnessed the emergence of social groups termed as middle class, who earned their wealth through an expanding overseas trade and from the manufacture of goods such as woolen and silk textiles that were either exported or bought by the rich members of society. In addition to merchants and manufacturers, the third estate included professionals such as lawyers or administrative officers. All of these were educated and believed that no group in society should be privileged by birth. Rather, a person's social position must depend on his merit. These ideas envisaging a society based on freedom and equal laws and opportunities for all were put forward by philosophers such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his two treatises on government, Locke sought to refute the doctrine of the divine and absolute right of the monarch. Rousseau carried the idea forward, proposing a form of government based on social contract between people and their representatives. In the spirit of laws, Montesquieu proposed a division of power within the government between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. This model of government was put into force in the USA after the 13 colonies declared their independence from Britain. The American Constitution and its guarantee of individual rights was an important example for political thinkers in France. The ideas of these philosophers were discussed intensively in salons and coffee houses and spread among the people through books and newspapers. These were frequently read aloud in groups for the benefit of those who could not read or write. The news that Louis XVI planned to impose further taxes to be able to meet the expenses of state generated anger and protest against the systems of privileges. This was around the time when the outbreak of revolution would happen. Louis XVI had to increase taxes for reasons you have already learned in the previous section. How do you think he could have gone about doing this? In France of the old regime, the monarch did not have the power to impose taxes according to his will alone. Rather, he had to call a meeting of the Estates General, which would then pass a proposal for new taxes. The Estates Generals was a political body to which the three estates sent their representatives. However, the monarch alone could decide when to call a meeting of this body. The last time it was done was in 1614, so one can imagine that for almost 2 centuries there was no meeting of the Estates Generals. On May the 5th, 1789, Louis XVI called together an assembly of the Estates Generals to pass proposals for new taxes. A resplendent hall in Versailles was prepared to host the delegates. The first and second estates sent 300 representatives each. The third estate was represented by its more prosperous and educated members. Peasants, artisans, and women were denied entry to the assembly. Voting in the estate generals in the past had been conducted according to the principle that each state had one vote. This time, too, Louis XVI was determined to continue the same practice. However, the members of the Third Estate demanded that the voting now be conducted by the assembly as a whole, where each member would have one vote. When the king rejected this proposal, members of the Third Estate walked out of the assembly in protest. The representatives of Third Estate were angry. On June the 20th, they assembled in the hall of an indoor tennis court in the grounds of Versailles. They declared themselves a national assembly, which was a path-breaking moment for the revolution, and swore not to disperse till they had drafted a constitution for France that would limit the powers of monarch. They were led by Mirabeau and Abbé. Mirabeau was born in a noble family but was convinced of the need to do away with the social feudal privileges. While the National Assembly was busy at Versailles drafting a constitution, the rest of the France seethed with turmoil. A severe winter had meant a bad harvest. The price of bread rose. At the same time, the king ordered troops to move into Paris, and on 14th of July, an angry, agitated crowd stormed and destroyed the prison or the fort of Bastille. In the countryside, the rumors spread from village to village that the lords of the manor had hired bands of brigands or goons who were on their way to destroy ripe crops. Caught in a frenzy of fear, peasants in several districts attacked the chateaus, the manors. They looted hoarded grain and burned down documents containing records of manorial dues. Faced with the power of his revolting subjects, Louis XVI finally accorded recognition to the National Assembly and accepted the principles that his powers would from now on be checked by a constitution. On the night of 4th of August 1789, the Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligations and taxes. Members of the clergy too were forced to give up their privileges. The tax tithe was abolished and the lands owned by church were confiscated. The National Assembly completed the draft of the Constitution in 1791. Its main object was to limit the powers of the monarch. These powers, instead of being concentrated in hands of one person, were now spread and assigned to different institutions. This made France a constitutional monarchy. The Constitution of 1791 vested the power to make laws in National Assembly, which was indirectly elected. That is, citizens voted for a group of electors who in turn chose the assembly. However, not all citizens had the right to vote. Only men above 25 years of age were given the status of active citizens. That is, they were entitled to vote. And all women were classed as passive citizens. To qualify as an elector and then as a member of assembly, a man had to belong to the highest bracket of taxpayers. The constitution began with a declaration of rights of man and citizen. Rights such as the right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, equality before law were established as natural and inalienable rights of individuals. That is, they belong to each human being by birth and could not be taken away. It was the duty of the state to protect each citizen's natural rights. Thank you.
Hold me close till I get up. Time is barely on our side.